The morning sun of June 4, 1942 cast long shadows across the Pacific waters as Admiral Chuichi Nagumo stood on the bridge of the aircraft carrier Akagi, his weathered hands gripping the rail with the intensity of a man who sensed destiny approaching. Below the surface of the deceptively calm ocean, the greatest naval confrontation of the Pacific War was about to unfold, and with it, the thread that would unravel Japan's imperial ambitions. The plan had seemed flawless in the war rooms of Tokyo. Operation MI, conceived by the brilliant Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, was designed to lure the remnants of the American Pacific Fleet into a decisive battle that would crush their naval power, once and for all. The target was Midway Atoll, a small, coral island that served as America's westernmost outpost in the Pacific. By capturing this strategic base, Japan would secure the outer perimeter of their expanding empire and force the United States into a negotiated peace. Nagumo commanded the Kido Butai, the first air fleet that had dealt the devastating blow at Pearl Harbor just 6 months earlier. His force was formidable. 4 aircraft carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Hiryu, and Soryu, escorted by battleships, cruisers, and destroyers, carrying over 250 aircraft manned by Japan's most experienced pilots. These same aviators had swept through the Pacific like a typhoon, conquering territory from the Philippines to the Dutch East Indies with seeming ease. Yet as the first wave of bombers and fighters launched from the carrier decks in the pre-dawn darkness, an unseen enemy was already moving into position. Unknown to the Japanese commanders, American codebreakers had cracked their naval cipher, designated JN-25, weeks earlier. Commander Joseph Rochefort and his team at Station Hypo in Pearl Harbor had worked tirelessly to decode intercepted Japanese messages, gradually piecing together the details of Operation MI. Admiral Chester Nimitz, commander of the Pacific Fleet, had used this intelligence windfall to position his forces with surgical precision. Task Force 16, commanded by Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance aboard the carrier Enterprise, and Task Force 17 under Rear Admiral Frank Fletcher on the Yorktown were already lying in wait northeast of Midway. The Americans had turned the tables on their enemies, transforming what should have been a Japanese ambush into a trap of their own design. As Nagumo's first strike wave approached Midway, the American defenders were ready. Marine fighters from VMF-2. 21 scrambled to intercept the incoming bombers, their Brewster Buffaloes and Grumman Wildcats climbing desperately to meet the enemy. The sky above the tiny atoll erupted in a deadly ballet of aerial combat, tracers streaming between aircraft as young men from both nations fought with the fury of those who knew they were fighting for their very survival. The Japanese pilots, veterans of countless victories, pressed their attack with characteristic precision. Bombs rained down on the airfield installations, fuel dumps, and defensive positions scattered across the 2-mile-long island. Smoke and flame billowed skyward as the Americans absorbed the punishment, their anti-aircraft guns spitting defiance at the attacking formations. But even as the first phase of the battle unfolded according to Japanese expectations, the seeds of disaster were already being sown. The element of surprise, that crucial advantage that had served Japan so well in the opening months of the war, had been lost. The hunter had become the hunted, and the fate of nations would soon hang in the balance of decisions made in the crucible of combat. Lieutenant Commander John Waldron adjusted his headset as he led Torpedo Squadron 8 away from the carrier, Hornet, his voice crackling over the radio to his 14 fellow pilots. The morning of June 4th had transformed from routine patrol to desperate combat as the American task forces closed with the Japanese fleet. Waldron's antiquated Douglas TBD Devastators, already obsolete by the standards of modern warfare, represented one of 3 torpedo squadrons tasked with the seemingly impossible mission of breaking through the Japanese combat air patrol to attack their carriers. The intelligence provided by Station Hypo had given Admiral Nimitz the priceless advantage of knowing where and when to strike, but knowledge alone could not overcome the stark reality of numbers and experience. The Japanese Kido Butai was defended by veteran Zero fighters, piloted by men who had honed their skills in the skies over China and perfected their craft during the Pearl Harbor attack. These pilots, members of an elite that the Japanese Navy had spent years training, represented the finest naval aviators in the world. According to declassified U.S. Navy records from the National Archives, the American torpedo squadrons faced overwhelming odds during their morning attacks on June 4th. 1942. As Waldron's squadron approached the Japanese fleet, they found themselves alone and exposed. The promised fighter escort had failed to rendezvous, leaving the slow-moving torpedo bombers to face the full fury of the Japanese defenses. Zeros swarmed down from their patrol positions like angry hornets, their 20-millimeter cannons and machine guns tearing into the vulnerable American aircraft. One by one, the devastators fell from the sky. Waldron's own aircraft was among the first to be shot down, the squadron commander's last radio transmission, a grim confirmation of their sacrifice. Within minutes, 14 of the 15 torpedo bombers had been destroyed, their crews joining the growing list of casualties in what was becoming the bloodiest day in the history of naval aviation. Similar scenes played out as Torpedo Squadrons 6 and 3 pressed their own attacks. The courage of these airmen was beyond question, but courage alone could not overcome the tactical disadvantages they faced. The Japanese Combat Air Patrol, directed by experienced fighter controllers aboard the carriers, methodically destroyed the attacking formations. Of the 41 torpedo bombers that had launched that morning, only 6 would return to their ships. Aboard the Japanese carriers, the scene was one of controlled chaos as flight deck crews prepared for the second phase of the operation. Admiral Nagumo faced a critical decision that would ultimately seal the fate of his fleet. The returning strike force from Midway had reported that a second attack on the island would be necessary to neutralize its defenses completely. This meant rearming his aircraft with high-explosive bombs instead of maintaining their armor-piercing armament intended for use against enemy ships. The decision seemed logical at the time. No American carriers had been detected in the area, and Midway's continued resistance posed a threat to the landing operations scheduled for the following day. Orders went out across the flight decks of all 4 carriers. Switch the armament. Loads. Prepare for a second strike against the island installations. It was at this moment of vulnerability that the American dive bombers finally found their targets. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, leading Bombing Squadron 6 from the Enterprise, had been searching for the Japanese fleet for over an hour when he spotted the white wake of a Japanese destroyer racing northward. The vessel was the Arashi, returning to rejoin the main force after an unsuccessful depth charge attack on the American submarine Nautilus. Following the destroyer's wake like a pointer indicating the location of prey, McCluskey's formation finally spotted the enemy carriers, spread across the blue Pacific waters. The sight that greeted the American pilots was beyond their most optimistic expectations. 4 aircraft carriers caught in the most vulnerable possible position, their flight decks crowded with aircraft being rearmed and refueled. Aviation gasoline, lines snaking across the wooden planking, bombs and torpedoes stacked in neat rows awaiting installation. The hands of fate moved with precise choreography as Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey raised his arm to signal the attack. At 10:24 on the morning of June 4, 1942, 37 Douglas SBD Dauntless dive bombers pushed over into their attack dives, their engines screaming as they plummeted toward the Japanese carriers spread below like models on a tabletop. This single moment would determine not just the outcome of the Battle of Midway, but the entire trajectory of the Pacific War. Aboard the Akagi, Admiral Nagumo watched in growing horror as the American dive bombers materialized out of the morning sky. His carriers were caught in the worst possible position, their flight decks crowded with aircraft in various stages of rearming. The decision to switch from ship attack ordnance to land attack bombs had created a logistical nightmare on the hangar decks, where armor-piercing bombs lay stacked alongside high-explosive weapons, aviation fuel hoses snaked between aircraft, and ammunition was scattered in dangerous proximity to potential ignition sources. The first bomb struck Akagi at 10:26, the explosions ripping through the flight deck and igniting the volatile mixture of fuel, ammunition, and aircraft below. Within minutes, the flagship of the Kido Butai was transformed from a proud warship into a floating inferno. Secondary explosions tore through the hangar spaces as stored ordnance detonated in chain reactions that no damage control party could hope to contain. Simultaneously, Lieutenant Commander Richard Best led his section of 3 dive bombers against the carrier Akagi while the remainder of his squadron targeted the Kaga. The second carrier suffered an even more catastrophic fate as multiple bomb hits turned her into a blazing wreck. The wooden flight deck, soaked with aviation gasoline from the refueling operations, became a furnace that consumed everything in its path. Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie's Bombing Squadron 3 from the Yorktown arrived over the target area at nearly the same moment, their SBDs adding to the destruction as they targeted the carrier Hiryu. The coordinated attack, achieved more by fortunate timing than deliberate planning, represented the kind of concentrated assault that naval theorists had envisioned but rarely seen executed with such devastating effect. The Japanese Combat Air Patrol, which had been flying low-level missions to intercept the earlier torpedo attacks, was caught completely out of position. The Zeros that had so effectively destroyed the American torpedo squadrons were now unable to climb quickly enough to intercept the dive bombers attacking from high altitude. The same tactical advantage that had served the Japanese so well against the torpedo planes now worked against them as their fighters struggled to gain altitude while the American bombers completed their attacks and escaped. Within the space of 6 minutes, 3 of Japan's 4 fleet carriers had been transformed from potent instruments of war into burning hulks. The Hiryu, positioned several miles away from her sister ships, escaped the initial onslaught and immediately began preparing a counterattack. Admiral Taman Yamaguchi, commanding Carrier Division 2 aboard the Hiryu, understood that his ship now carried the hopes of the entire Japanese fleet. The scenes of destruction aboard the 3 stricken carriers defied description. On Akagi, Admiral Nagumo was forced to transfer his flag to the cruiser Nagara, as flames made his flagship uninhabitable. Captain Taijiro Aoki fought desperately to save his ship, but the fires had spread beyond any hope of control. The pride of the Japanese Navy, the carrier that had launched the attack on Pearl Harbor, was dying beneath his feet. Similar tragedies were unfolding aboard Kaga and Soryu. These vessels, which had served as the backbone of Japanese naval aviation, were being consumed by the very weapons they had carried into battle. The irony was not lost on the surviving Japanese officers. Their own bombs and fuel were destroying their ships more effectively than enemy action alone could have accomplished. The transformation of the tactical situation was so sudden and complete that it took time for the full implications to register with commanders on both sides. In the space of those crucial 6 minutes, the balance of naval power in the Pacific had shifted decisively in favor of the United States. Captain Tomeo Kaku stood on the bridge of the Hiryu, the last operational Japanese carrier, as smoke columns from his 3 burning sister ships stained the afternoon sky. The weight of the entire operation now rested on his vessel and the remaining aircraft that Admiral Taman Yamaguchi could muster for what everyone understood would be a desperate counterattack. The time was 13:30 hours on June 4th, and the fate of the Kido Butai hung in the balance. Yamaguchi, an aggressive and capable commander known throughout the Japanese Navy for his fighting spirit, wasted no time in organizing a strike against the American carriers. His remaining aircraft were limited: 18 Aichi D-3A Val dive bombers and 6 Zero fighters, all that could be scraped together from the Hiryu's decimated air group and survivors from the other carriers. Leading this force was Lieutenant Michio Kobayashi, a veteran pilot who understood that this mission represented Japan's last chance to salvage something from the disaster that had befallen the fleet. The American task forces, meanwhile, were dealing with their own challenges. The Yorktown, Admiral Fletcher's flagship, had been operating with battle damage sustained during the Battle of the Coral Sea just 1 month earlier. Repairs at Pearl Harbor had restored her to fighting condition, but the carrier remained vulnerable. More critically, the success of the morning attacks had created a dangerous overconfidence among some American commanders who believed the battle was already won. At 14:05, radar operators aboard the Yorktown detected the incoming Japanese strike. The Combat Air Patrol, consisting of Grumman F-4F Wildcats from Fighting Squadron 3, scrambled to intercept the attackers as the carrier's crew prepared for battle. Captain Elliot Buckmaster ordered the ship to general quarters, while damage control parties took their positions throughout the vessel. The attack that followed demonstrated the skill and determination that had made Japanese naval aviation so formidable during the early months of the war. Despite being outnumbered and flying aircraft that were showing their age, Kobayashi's pilots pressed home their assault with characteristic precision. 3 bombs struck the Yorktown, causing significant damage to the flight deck and starting fires in the lower compartments. Naval historians from the U.S. Naval War College have documented that the damage to Yorktown during this attack was initially considered manageable by her crew. However, the American damage control capabilities, honed through months of hard-won experience, proved superior to anything the Japanese had anticipated. Within 2 hours, the Yorktown's crew had the fires under control and the flight deck operational for limited aircraft recovery operations. The carrier, which Japanese pilots reported as heavily damaged and possibly sinking, was not only still afloat, but preparing to resume flight operations. This remarkable recovery would prove to be a critical factor in the next phase of the battle. When a second Japanese strike from the Hiryu, consisting of 10 Kate torpedo bombers and 6 Zero escorts, arrived over the American task force at 15:30, the pilots were shocked to see what appeared to be an undamaged carrier operating aircraft. Assuming this was a different vessel from the one they had attacked earlier, they concentrated their attack on what they believed was a fresh target. Lieutenant Commander Yahachi Tanabe led his torpedo bombers in a skillfully executed attack that placed 2 torpedoes into the Yorktown's port side. The carrier, already weakened by the earlier bomb damage, began to list heavily to port as flooding spread through the lower compartments. This time, the damage was too severe for even the most heroic efforts to overcome. Captain Buckmaster, recognizing that his ship was in mortal danger, reluctantly gave the order to abandon ship. The evacuation was conducted with the discipline and efficiency that had become hallmarks of the U.S. Navy's Pacific Fleet operations. Destroyers moved alongside to take off the crew, while the Yorktown, listing at an increasingly dangerous angle, slowly settled in the water. The loss of the Yorktown was a significant blow to American forces, but it came at a time when the larger tactical situation had already been decided. The Hiryu, having expended her remaining aircraft in the 2 strikes against the American carrier, now found herself alone and defenseless as the sun began to set over the Pacific battlefield. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the Pacific as Enterprise and Hornet turned into the wind to launch what would become the final act of the Battle of Midway. Admiral Raymond Spruance, now commanding both American task forces following Admiral Fletcher's transfer from the damaged Yorktown, understood that the Hiryu represented the last threat to his victory. The Japanese carrier had already demonstrated her capability by damaging the Yorktown. She could not be allowed to escape or to launch another strike. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, the hero of the morning attack, was grounded due to fuel exhaustion from his earlier mission. Command of the strike fell to Lieutenant Earl Gallagher, leading 24 Dauntless dive bombers from Scouting, Squadron 6 and Bombing Squadron 6. These were the same squadrons that had devastated the Akagi and Kaga hours earlier, their pilots now seasoned by combat and hungry to finish what they had started. Aboard the Hiryu, Admiral Yamaguchi and Captain Kaku were acutely aware of their precarious position. With no aircraft remaining for defensive combat air patrol, and no possibility of support from the burning hulks of their sister carriers, they could only wait for the inevitable American response. The carrier's crew worked frantically to prepare what few operational aircraft remained, but everyone understood that their situation was hopeless. The American dive bombers found their target at 17:30. The Hiryu steaming alone on the darkening ocean, while the smoke from the 3 other carriers continued to mark the scene of the morning's destruction. Gallagher's attack was executed with the same precision that had characterized the earlier strikes, but this time there was no element of surprise. The Japanese carrier's anti-aircraft guns opened fire as the SBDs began their dives, filling the sky with black bursts of flak. 4 direct hits sealed the Hiryu's fate. The bombs penetrated the flight deck and exploded in the hangar spaces below, igniting aviation fuel and ammunition in the same catastrophic chain reaction that had doomed her sister ships. Within minutes, the last operational carrier of the Kido Butai was blazing from stem to stern, her crew fighting desperately to contain fires that had already grown beyond any hope of control. Admiral Yamaguchi, recognizing that his ship was lost, made the decision that would cement his place in Japanese naval history. Rather than abandon the Hiryu, he chose to remain aboard and go down with his ship. Captain Kaku made the same choice, and together these 2 officers represented the Bushido spirit that had inspired the Japanese Navy throughout its rise to prominence. Their decision to die with their ship reflected not just personal honor, but the magnitude of the disaster that had befallen Japan's naval aviation. The destruction of the 4 Japanese carriers represented more than just the loss of ships. It marked the end of an era in naval warfare. These vessels had been the instruments through which Japan had projected power across the Pacific, the platforms from which her aviators had achieved stunning victories from Pearl Harbor to the Indian Ocean. More importantly, the experienced aircrew who died with these ships represented an irreplaceable asset that Japan could never hope to replace. As darkness fell over the Pacific on June 4, 1942, the strategic balance of the war had shifted irrevocably. The Japanese Navy, which had dominated the ocean for 6 months, now found itself on the defensive. Admiral Yamamoto, receiving reports of the disaster from his distant command position, understood immediately that his carefully planned operation had not only failed, but had dealt a mortal blow to Japan's offensive capabilities. The surviving Japanese surface vessels, including powerful battleships and cruisers that had played no role in the day's fighting, were now vulnerable without air cover. Admiral Yamamoto made the painful decision to withdraw his forces, abandoning the Midway operation and conceding the field to the Americans. The hunter had become the hunted, and Japan's dreams of Pacific domination were sinking beneath the waves, along with her aircraft carriers. The dawn of June 5, 1942, revealed a transformed Pacific Ocean, where the rising sun illuminated 4 funeral pyres, marking the graves of Japan's naval aviation supremacy. Admiral Chester Nimitz, receiving the first complete reports of the previous day's action at his Pearl Harbor headquarters, understood immediately that his forces had achieved something far greater than a tactical victory. The Battle of Midway had fundamentally altered the strategic balance of the Pacific War, creating opportunities that would shape American offensive operations for the remainder of the conflict. The human cost of Japan's defeat was staggering in its implications for the future conduct of the war. Over 3,000 Japanese naval personnel had perished with their ships, but more critically, approximately 100 experienced pilots had been lost. These aviators represented the cream of Japanese naval aviation, men who had trained for years before the war and gained invaluable combat experience during the opening months of the Pacific conflict. Their loss created a void in Japanese capabilities that could never be adequately filled. Japan's industrial capacity, while impressive, could replace the lost aircraft carriers within months. The Shokaku and Zuikaku, damaged during the Battle of the Coral Sea, would return to service by late 1942. New carriers were already under construction in Japanese shipyards, and aircraft production was being expanded to meet the growing demands of the war. However, the experienced pilots who had made these weapons effective were irreplaceable assets that required years to develop properly. The American victory at Midway also validated the intelligence breakthrough that had made the triumph possible. Commander Joseph Rochefort and his cryptanalysts at Station Hypo had provided Admiral Nimitz with the kind of strategic intelligence that commanders throughout history had dreamed of possessing. The success of their code-breaking efforts would lead to increased emphasis on intelligence gathering and analysis throughout the remainder of the war. According to official U.S. Navy historical records, the victory at Midway marked the beginning of a sustained American offensive that would continue until Japan's surrender in 1945. The strategic implications of the battle extended far beyond the immediate tactical results. Japan's defeat at Midway forced a fundamental reassessment of their Pacific strategy. The dream of establishing a defensive perimeter that would secure their conquered territories and force the United States into a negotiated peace was now clearly unrealistic. Instead, Japan found herself committed to a defensive war of attrition that played to American industrial and technological advantages. Admiral Yamamoto, the architect of the Pearl Harbor attack and the Midway operation, understood better than most the long-term consequences of the defeat. His prediction before the war that Japan could run wild for 6 months to a year in the Pacific had proven remarkably accurate. The Midway defeat occurred almost exactly 6 months after Pearl Harbor, marking the end of Japan's offensive phase and the beginning of their long retreat across the Pacific. The American victory also had profound psychological effects on both sides. For the United States, Midway provided the first clear evidence that Japan could be defeated in major fleet actions. The myth of Japanese naval invincibility, carefully cultivated through victories at Pearl Harbor, the Java Sea, and Ceylon, was shattered permanently. American morale, which had suffered through months of defeats and retreats, received a tremendous boost that would sustain the nation through the grinding campaigns that lay ahead. For Japan, the defeat represented a shock from which the nation's leadership never fully recovered. The loss of 4 aircraft carriers in a single day was difficult enough to accept, but the realization that American code breakers had penetrated their most secret communications created a crisis of confidence that affected every aspect of their war planning. The Japanese Navy, which had considered itself the master of the Pacific, now faced the prospect of fighting a defensive war against an enemy that appeared to know their every move. The Battle of Midway thus stands as one of history's decisive turning points, a moment when the trajectory of a global conflict shifted permanently. The Japanese thrust into the Central Pacific, which might have succeeded if executed 6 months earlier, instead became the catalyst for their ultimate defeat. Admiral Nagumo's carriers, which had carried the rising sun across vast expanses of ocean, now rested on the bottom of the Pacific, their crews joining the ancestors in a watery grave that marked the high tide of Japanese expansion. The fate of nations had indeed pivoted sharply after Midway's strike, and the long road to Tokyo Bay lay ahead for the resurgent American Pacific Fleet.